Usually, I strive to present my reviews as objectively as I can. This means formulating arguments as rationally as possible with little or no emotional baggage. With Danganronpa V3, however, I have to make an exception. For almost its entirety, DV3 captured my imagination as thoroughly as Danganronpa ever has, delivering consistently with the humour, absurdity, creativity, and sentimentality that made the series shine from the very beginning. It's hard to hold in contrast, therefore, the deflation I felt at its climax, a disappointment that it's fair to say will paint this review as far more critical than I ever hoped it would be. Before we meet that stumbling block, however, let's celebrate how we got to that point. For those new to the killing game, welcome. For those returning, welcome back. For the most part, DV3 stands on its own, following a recipe refined across 2 previous games, in which a collection of school-bound teenagers are trapped together and thrown into a life or death struggle at the behest of an all-too-lovable and all-too bloodthirsty teddy bear. In this way, there's little new in DV3. Players return to a desperate search for clues to their imprisonment, where any drop of new information can keep the hope of escape alive, and any hint of weakness is a gory invitation. Indeed, despite their best efforts to the contrary, betrayal stalks the students of Hope's Peak Academy as relentlessly as ever before, and it's not long before our little guinea pigs succumb to the killing game, seduced by the promise of murder. This is where Danganronpa players transform from hapless student into budding detective, and gameplay transitions to a thorough investigation of the crime scene and any venues relevant to the case at hand. Danganronpa's investigation segments remain interesting thanks to the elegance and succinctness of the scenarios. Rarely is any new tidbit of information revealed prior to a murder irrelevant to the next case. So, any discovery in the grounds of the academy or about the participants of the killing game is crucial. As a result, investigations have always revealed how these new discoveries have been tied neatly together in strange and complex ways. Danganronpa's broad puzzle-solving ethos is akin to constructing a blood-spattered jigsaw, and investigation has always been the series' way of pointing players towards the corner and edge pieces as a place to begin. And from here, more keenly observant or dedicated players can begin to venture towards the centre of the jigsaw. Soon after investigation, the inevitable class trial begins, and now students must fully cooperate to unveil the murderer in their ranks by adducing evidence, unravelling testimony, and attempting to pin down the blackened classmate lest they lose the game and ultimately their lives. In all these ways, DV3 remains just the same as the games that came before it. Many of the same flaws return, some of which, it's unfortunate to say, have become magnified for long-time players, for whom some of the killing game's novelty has begun to erode. Investigation, though generally streamlined and straightforward, can at times become rudderless when investigating multiple locations if quick travel is limited for story reasons, so the accumulated load times dampen any sense of urgency and can lead to players traipsing unenthusiastically to the next point of interest. Within class trials themselves, many of the same logical hiccups the series has always fought are also present. No matter the context of the problem, the particular phrasing of the answer to many questions has always been troublesome. Thus, it can often be difficult to grasp which precise piece of evidence refutes a particular inconsistency in a character's testimony when there are potentially multiple items of evidence which prima facie imply the same inconsistency. For the most part, this is not too prevalent in the non-stop debate, which feels as refined as we've yet seen it. However, the issue is particularly problematic in word-based games like Hangman's Gambit, where explaining a phenomenon can seem multifarious, and the syntax the game chooses for a particular phrase can be perplexing. Furthermore, poorly explained new mechanics or minigames can also become sources of frustration. I spent about half a dozen attempts trying to reveal all the items in the newly introduced Mind Mine before realizing that success only entailed unearthing the single necessary piece of evidence. Though the game is often aware of this, it still chooses to cram unexciting tutorials before any new minigame, which consistently prove testing to a player's patience. Nonetheless, as with previous entries in the series, these issues can easily be overlooked because of the breadth and lightheartedness of the tools Danganronpa gives players to make discoveries, and it's one of the major charms of the game. Meanwhile, the brisk pace set by the class trials continually proves that dwelling on previous problems is always eclipsed quickly by major revelation. And so much of that revelation is glorious. Time and time again, DV3 presents sublimely labyrinthine trial scenarios, beginning with what I consider to be one of, if not the most compelling trials the series has ever seen. DV3 consistently demonstrates the ability to subvert structural expectations and present surprises beyond substantive or circumstantial novelty. In other words, there's a richness to be found that far exceeds new tools, locations, and murder weapons. Unfortunately, there are still a few more issues to mention with DV3. Free time, during which the player can interact with other students at their leisure, has begun to feel a little less interesting than it once did. Unfortunately, it's a little difficult to pin down why. It's easy to suggest that the cast of DV3 is simply not as engaging as its predecessors, but for the most part, I don't believe that to be the case. It's clear why the feature remains in the game, to give breathing space to players and add a degree of punctuation to the events of the game before careening off into the next subplot. Still, this is perhaps as unimportant as free time has ever felt, and I often found myself making the choice to sit out free time and recuperate from the previous trial, a testament perhaps more to the intensity of those trials. As a brief technical aside, the Vita version of DV3 suffers from audio quality problems, most notably the severely compressed VO. This is a real pity because the handheld version is generally the preferred way to experience most visual novel style games because of the easily digestible size of text, so it's highly recommended that handheld players download the audio quality patch. These issues are not insurmountable, but they're worth bearing in mind for those who want the strongest audio experience, especially considering Danganronpa leans so heavily on both its soundtrack and character performances. Indeed, those explosive personalities are still a core facet of DV3. Though they're always played primarily for comedy, the cast of Danganronpa has always seemed just a touch too familiar to be disregarded as simply comic relief or necessary cannon fodder, no matter how large or small the role they play. As they always have, each caricature, in their utmost extravagance, contains a kernel of reality so acute that they can effortlessly flit between hyperbolic and down-to-earth at the drop of a hat. This immediacy, above all else, is the feature of Danganronpa that I consider to be almost completely unrivaled across most games, and it's the knowledge that so many of its creative decisions have robust and well-considered foundations that allows DV3 to cut directly to the point whenever it needs to. Just like Monokuma, the series has always been a multifaceted entity, and DV3 is no exception. Again and again, DV3 demonstrates how to capture tone with the proficiency that most AAA games can only aspire to. The icy chill of terror, the giddy dread of revelation, or the quiet ache of loneliness. This proficiency has always been born from a combination of strong musical motif that at this point carries a palpable history with each note, and the large, almost immobilizing emptiness of the setting, a confined, emotional melting pot that can be manipulated by the whims of its extreme characters. Even more, it's fair to say DV3 goes further than its predecessors, capturing sentimentality more strongly than the series has previously. Tragedy, therefore, is more palpable than ever, and DV3 matures in a way that no longer leans on pure debased evil or convenient motive, and manages to push through its self-created comedic or cliched noise to present moments that can only be described as genuinely inspirational. As I finish this review, the two words that continue to crop up to best describe Danganronpa are incisiveness and consequence. For most of its length, DV3 feels consequential in the strength, cunning and capability of its cast that makes their loss all the more poignant and their betrayal all the more heartbreaking. Not to mention the way in which the series wraps moment-to-moment revelation within its greater mystery. Every moment feels earned, a necessary and unavoidable step to uncovering a greater truth. It's such a shame, therefore, that DV3 concludes the way it does, seemingly leaving these two core tenets of the franchise behind. There are many problems that plague the final trial. It's circular and drawn out. It contains some of the most awkward implementation of the trial mechanics we've ever seen, and unearths numerous questions left unanswered. In the end, inconsequence is the true despair of DV3, and intentionally so, but inconsequence need not be an empty path as DV3 seems to think it must be. To my mind, its conclusion is revelatory without being incisive. Shock value aside, what the game imparts is a message that anyone who embraces fiction can easily comprehend, even if they rarely articulate it. All it manages to achieve is to make something explicit that largely goes unmentioned, and the only real surprise is the fact that it was said, rather than the message itself. Is it fair to say that what transpires is poorly thought out? Absolutely not, but what disappoints me is the thorough lack of decisiveness. Is the conclusion interesting on its own? Most certainly. Is it appropriate? It could be argued yes, its absurdity is certainly fitting. To the contrary, however, I would argue that such a reading only embraces Danganronpa at its most superficial. The ending fails to grasp with any conviction the bite that the series has always had, and though what happens is interesting in a vacuum, its structural subversion is something we've seen before, not to mention that what these events apply of greater meaning is frankly boring. So what can you conclude about DV3 therefore? That it ends in disappointment? That the climax isn't worth the journey? Perhaps, but that's too simple. My time with DV3 contained some of the highest peaks in the series, and I'll remember it in many ways as the most refined version of Danganronpa. Instead, what I hope I've made clear is just how highly I regard this series, and clearly the fact that I hold it in such high esteem is what allowed it to disappoint me the way it did. There's immense irony to a game that tries to convey the veracity of truth born from fiction, but chooses to do so with a truth not born from the fiction itself. It's too easy to say that with its final twist, the game betrayed me and left me burnt. Rather, for the first time in the series, it seemed to lack energy. For the first time in the series, it felt like the performer faltered. No longer was the master puppeteer pulling the strings behind the scenes. No longer was the maestro marshalling the orchestra. The grandmaster lacked that final trick to checkmate his opponent. For the first time in the series, I felt like I wasn't entertained, and that is what I find truly disappointing.